Hi, this video will be on the Napoleonic Wars, mainly the key battles which occurred from 1803 to 1815. I'll be analyzing the following battles: the Battle of Austerlitz, the Battle of Borodino, the Battle of Waterloo. But first, an introduction on Napoleon Bonaparte, the man whom the wars are named after. Napoleon was born in the island of Corsica, just south of France. From a young age, he had already begun to show signs of being an artillery officer, such as being good at maths, which was required to be an artillery officer. While in military school, Napoleon read a lot of books on the conquests of famous military figures, such as Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Frederick the Great. This proved vital for his future as a military commander.
A few moments later.
Fast forward a few years later, and the French Revolution happens in 1789. It happens because of growing discontent of the people for the King of France at that time. Napoleon put himself in the right place at the right time. He came back from the French-Egyptian campaign, and he and his brother organized a military coup in 1799 and succeeded. The French government at the time was very weak in terms of power and could not control the citizens. At the time of the coup, Napoleon was in charge of the troops around Paris, and so all he had to do was storm the government chambers with troops. With this, the government was abolished, and he proclaimed himself as first consul of France. This did not sit well with other Europeans, such as Britain, Austria, and Russia, so they declared war on France. Fast forward a few years later.
One eternity later.
The actual Napoleonic Wars start in 1803. However, 1803 to 1805 saw no major conflict. First of all, the Battle of Austerlitz, which took place in the Austrian Empire. It was on the 2nd December 1805, and it was a part of the War of the Third Coalition. Napoleon was facing the combined armies of the Russians and the Austrians. Napoleon had around 65,000 men, while the combined army of Russia and Austria had around 80,000 men. Napoleon decided to play a psychological game with the Allied army. First, he sent a general to the Austro-Russian forces, aka the Allies, to propose to avoid battle. This looked like a weakness to the emperors of Austria and Russia, and they pressed for an attack. Napoleon also left a crucial defensive position unguarded, the Pratzen Heights, just to pretend that he's weak. This worked well as though a general of the Allies, General Kutuzov, still sensed something was wrong. He was forced to attack by the emperors of the nations. Furthermore, Napoleon requested to meet with the Tsar of Russia, but the Tsar sent his aide instead, Count Dolgoruki instead. The meeting was another part of the trap, as Napoleon intentionally expressed anxiety and hesitation to his opponents. Nonetheless, the Allies fell into the trap. The battle began at 8 a.m. on 2nd December 1805, with Allied columns starting to pour against the French right, but they moved at a slow pace, and the French were mostly successful in repelling their attacks. The Allies attacked the village of Sokolnitz, but their assaults proved unsuccessful. This makes Sokolnitz one of the most fought over areas in the battlefield, changed hands multiple times as the day progressed. While the Allied troops attacked the French right, the Russian General Kutuzov's Corps stopped at the Pratzen Heights and stayed still. The young Tsar of Alexander I did not share Kutuzov's correctly cautious approach, so he moved the Corps from the Pratzen Heights, and so pushed the Allied army to their grave. The French now advanced against the Allied center. The attacks by French General Saint-Hilaire and Vandamme, just to the north of Pratzen, split the Allied army in two, and left the French in a perfect strategic position to win the battle. At about 8:45, satisfied at the weakness in the enemy's center, Napoleon asked General Soult to attack the Pratzen Heights. A dense fog helped cloud the advance, but as the French went up the slope, the legendary son of Austerlitz ripped the mist apart and encouraged them forward at a greater speed. Russian soldiers and commanders on top of the heights were stunned to see so many French troops coming towards them. General panic now seized the Allied army, and it abandoned the field in all possible directions. The Allies suffered a crushing defeat, with the Tsar saying, the war of the Third Coalition ended. The Battle of Austerlitz is regarded as one of the most famous battles in the world by multiple historians, and is still remembered fondly by the French till this day. It is also regarded as one of the best strategic victories of history. Secondly, the Battle of Borodino. It was part of the French invasion of Russia and was fought on September 7th, 1812. Napoleon had 130,000 men, while the Russians, led by General Kutuzov, had 120,000 men. Napoleon had invaded Russia because the Russians weren't following the continental system, basically an economic blockade against Britain. The Russians just outside of Moscow, who had arranged a defensive line in front of Moscow. It was a good place as there was good visibility, and the French had to come from thick woods. The French attacked first, and they engaged in frontal assaults on the Russians. Eventually, the French seemed to be winning, and General Kutuzov decided to retreat Moscow, leaving the city undefended, as defending Moscow at all costs would mean defeat as well. Napoleon's refusal to commit the Imperial Guard has been said to cost him a lot in the future, his crown and his army. After the French won, they moved into Moscow. However, they found the city empty as the Russians had taken away valuables such as food. The Tsar also refused to negotiate a peace with Napoleon, and so Napoleon was forced to retreat as his army dwindled due to starvation and sickness. During his retreat, the army was harassed by the Russians, but they did not engage in a large-scale battle, as that would be disastrous. By the time the French army returned to France, there were only 23,000 men. This battle is known as a Pyrrhic victory, meaning that though there is victory, the losses come at a very high cost. This was one of the bloodiest battles at the time, causing 60,000 deaths and many more injuries. Lastly, the Battle of Waterloo, which happened in 1815. Usually when the question of the greatest commander comes up, one of the many answers is Napoleon Bonaparte. And yet the battle he is most remembered for is the Battle of Waterloo, where he lost. After the failed invasion of Russia, the Allies declared war on France yet again in 1814. And this time Napoleon couldn't win, so he abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba. Napoleon escaped from exile and landed in France. As he advanced to Paris, more and more people joined his side, and thus increasing the size of his army. The King of France, Louis XVIII, fled once again. However, European leaders found out and immediately declared war on France. Almost all of Europe was pitted against Napoleon. It was Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, Netherlands, and many more against France and Naples, as the King of Naples was one of Napoleon's marshals. Napoleon could not have possibly defended against all the coalition armies, so he went for a preemptive strike against the smaller and divided armies of the coalition. Waterloo is a village in Belgium, and he attacked there as it was close to France. Napoleon met the Anglo-Dutch army at Waterloo. The French had 73,000 men, and the combined army of the Dutch and the English and the Prussians had 118,000 men. The Allied army was commanded by the Duke of Wellington, a general in the British Army. Later on, the Prussian army also comes in, and that army is led by General Blucher. Rains had softened the ground, which affected the speed of infantrymen, so Napoleon delayed his attack. This proved very costly later on. Napoleon first attacked the chateau of Hougoumont in the battlefield, but the attack failed. Later on, they also marched on La Haye Sainte. Marshal Ney of the French army thought the army was retreating, and so decided to form a cavalry charge. This was very ineffective, as the Anglo-Dutch army had formed hollow squares designed especially to repel a cavalry attack. It is said that this may have contributed to Napoleon's defeat. Eventually, La Haye Sainte fell to the French. This allowed the French to attack the Allied center, which would mean a victory for the French. However, soon the Prussians, commanded by Blucher, began to arrive to the right of the French. As the Anglo-Dutch army was on the verge of defeat, Napoleon decided to commit the Imperial Guard to the battle. The Imperial Guard were the most feared troops in all of Europe, but their strength had been diminished, as it was a mix of veterans and soldiers who had never fought battles before. They marched to the center of the Anglo-Dutch army. This failed, as the Allies opened fire and infantrymen were no match for gunfire, and so began the retreat of the once undefeated and most feared troops in the world. This gave a huge morale boost to Wellington's army, yet some French soldiers still stood their ground, saying, the guard dies, but it does not surrender. Eventually, the French dispersed and retreated. Napoleon's defeat led to his second abdication and the fall of Paris yet again. This battle determined the fate of all of Europe from 19th century to early 20th century. Napoleon was sent to permanent exile to St. Helena, was really far away, located in the Atlantic, next to Africa. He died there in 1821. However, the circumstances of his death are unclear, most saying it was because of a stomach ulcer. Wellington, when asked who was the greatest general of the day, answered, "In this age, in past ages, and in any age, Napoleon." Throughout his military career, Napoleon won 55 battles out of 71 battles. He only lost 8 battles, none against a weaker force. Thus, Napoleon won 77% of his battles. To this day, some of his battles are taught in military schools as examples.